Well, welcome, Rama. It is lovely to have you here. Today, we are doing a different session for Flourishing by Design, the Human Flourishing Network group within Harvard University, or FxD. For our monthly FxD meeting of May 2025, we welcome Rama Gheerawo today. Welcome. Nice to have you, Rama.
Very good to be here.
Lovely. Yes, we do not have a live session with the group, but instead we are recording, and Rama is going to do a presentation, kind of keeping to our normal structure, and speak to us, give us some background on what he's doing now, what he's up to going forward, and then we're going to do some Q&A afterwards just to get him in conversation. So, Rama, I'm going to give the floor to you if you'd like to share your screen, and we'll go from there.
Perfect. And look at that, the technology works.
Always
So
a
it's a
joy
great,
when that happens.
yes, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be virtually meeting you all through this group. And Jenna, so great to see you again after a couple of years. And I've been following your career closely, and I think we've got that sort of virtuous and virtual circle of engagement already there. So thank you for having me. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about creative leadership. By way of introduction, for myself, I've spent 26 years working in inclusive design and developed this idea of creative leadership very much from the inclusive approach, applying inclusive design to broken, challenged, difficult models of leadership. I'm a professor, visiting prof in a couple of universities, and always looking for the chance to engage with universities and to share modules, etc., workshops, projects. Personally, I've led over 85 projects globally and worked in over 40 countries. Inclusive design is a great love in my life. In fact, I describe it as life because it is life itself. Why do I say that? Because everything around us goes through a design decision. We might as well make it as inclusive as possible of people of all needs and of planet. But on screen, what you'll see is an image of a book with a white background with black text, and there is an orange pencil horizontally on screen. And the book title is Creative Leadership: How to Design the 21st Century Organization. And it is about design. It's published by Penguin, who say this is one of the few books that's written by a creative on leadership. Their words, not mine, but it has spent 18 years, well, 15 years for the book, 18 years in total now. Within the realm of academic research, we've brought together design, neuroscience, etc. Personally, I also have two organizations I wanted to introduce. I have a bit of a portfolio career now, having spent 26 years at the Royal College of Art, where I was Deputy Director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design for 8 years, and then Director for its last 10, for the last 10 years. And one of the most amazing places and amazing roles in my life, but it sort of set me up for what comes next. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little black and white logo with a blue, red, and yellow square, triangle, and dot. And that is called EIDD, Design for All Europe. So this is one of the largest networks of inclusive design, design for all, universal design, and I was recently elected as their president. I also run my own company that teaches modules, workshops for academia, for industry, for government and the public sector, and that's called Instill. And the logo are two interlocking circles, they're ripples, where they're instilling knowledge into each other, and there is a smaller purple circle and a larger orange circle, and they really, for me, are reminiscent of the colors of dawn and dusk, because as I like to say and like to believe, dawn and dusk are both endings and beginnings. So wherever we are in our career, that's important. And whatever we're doing in the day, both endings and beginnings. So I'm going to speed up a little bit here so we get to those questions. But why do we need creative leadership? You know, Jenna's asked me to focus very much on this, and I'd love to, because I've written over 70 papers on inclusive design. Google Scholar or academia.eu will tell you where, and I'm not affiliated to either, by the way. They're just great search places. But why do we need creative leadership? Why do we need this inclusive model of leadership? Well, if you're to believe Forbes, and you know, this is my greatest researched slide ever, just screen grabs from the internet. But Forbes talk about how bad managers are enough reason to quit, according to LinkedIn. So LinkedIn do quite a lot of research. And if you think of companies like McKinsey with their diversity report, what we need is a diversification of leadership. Now, on the right is a headline that talks about empowering innovation. But how do we actually do this? So creative leadership is that bridge from academia to industry, and to public sector as well, that brings innovation to the fore. And we all have a part to play. I think there's amazing things that happen in academia that don't translate to industry, and vice versa. So having worked in that bridge for, you know, over 2 decades, creative leadership embodies that. On screen is a QR code and a screenshot of the book again. And it came out on the 17th of April this year as a paperback, an ebook, and an audiobook. And if you like the sound of my voice, you'll be pleased to know that I read the audiobook. If you don't like the sound of my voice, I apologize in advance. And of course, there is a QR code that will take you to Penguin's website, which will link to all the major retailers, online and offline around the world, where the book is being sold. There's now an image of me without a beard. This was from 6 years ago, 7 years ago, pre-COVID. And here I am holding what looks like a gun, but it's actually a video camera. And we are shadowing. There's a number of other people in the picture, including a woman in a wheelchair in a stripy black and white coat. And a colleague of mine is pushing her. In the background, you can see a window reflecting back an image of a London street and a London taxi. And this was a project we did looking at the London taxi, bringing inclusive design into the London taxi. And why do I have this there? Well, it's to prove that I don't just sit behind a desk. I don't just write papers. Design creativity is an active thing. You must go out into the world, speak to people, and connect with people. On screen is a definition of inclusive design from the UK government, circa 2000, and it reads, inclusive design is defined as including the needs of the widest number of people in your design. So this was very much the starting point in my own mind for creative leadership. There is a problem, however, if you type in the word designer on any text or WhatsApp application, SMS application on your smartphone, you know, there's some predictive icons that come up, and on screen you could see them. They're literally 2 little yellow faces, one male, one female, but they look like jaundiced French people from the 1940s, and they're holding a paintbrush and a palette, which seems to lock designers into just being some artistic mode of expression. But of course, creatives, we're much more than that. We're facilitators, we're the creators of economy, of artistry, of scale, of human life. We're strategists, we're business people, we're all of these things, and we're academics and researchers too. It's not just scientists who make academic breakthroughs, it's also creatives. Why creative leadership? Well, for too long, people have been excluded. Unheard voices should be heard, and unseen voices should be seen. And there is no excuse for this not happening anymore. Creative leadership came from some points of deep dissatisfaction and even despair when I was working with in inclusive design, and I saw how much people were excluded by in so many different ways, and I ended up in tears in the shower. And I thought, what can I do as a small designer, as a small academic in this little life of mine on this great planet of ours? What can I do? And what came to mind was, you're a designer. Can you redesign something that would change everything? And the answer came resounding back: leadership. So those voices of dissatisfaction, turn them into gentle dissatisfaction, and they'll absolutely drive you forward, especially if you're of an inclusive mindset. On screen is a articulation I came up with whilst at the Royal College, which boiled down exclusion into 4 entry points: exclusion by age, ability, gender, and race. Why is this important? Because the same sun rises and sets on us all every day, but that day can be radically different depending on these 4 factors. And I also realize that when you look at this, most of us are excluded from leadership. Most of us are excluded from many things every day. And there's many ways people can be excluded, but these are 4 ways you can self-describe, so they're entry points. It's about promoting creativity. It's in the title, creative leadership. Creativity is important because it makes every conversation better, but it feels like it's under attack. What's the first things companies or organizations cut? They cut research, or they cut creativity. And creatives sometimes can feel like slightly less focused people. But it's not just about art or design. It's a human birthright. We're all born with it, but somehow it's educated out of us. Creativity is the ability to imagine, to respond, to adapt, and to express. And who doesn't want to express? You know, we shouldn't go back to the Middle Ages, where the most dangerous thing you could be was a social innovator. You know, they didn't want you to socially innovate. They wanted you to follow church and state. Certainly here in the UK, where I'm based. But how do we allow people to innovate, to express, both within the academic institution, within the organization? That's incredibly important. And creative leadership has some strategies. It also contains the 3 superpowers of creative leadership that I'll get onto. But there are many barriers to creativity, and years of research led to a diagram you'll see on screen, which it can feel like a marathon. So you start on the left and have to climb the mountain of process, navigate the shark pit of mindset of people being stuck in the past. You know, we tried creativity in 1995 on a Friday afternoon and it didn't work. Then there's budget, and that's always a downhill conversation. So the bicycle there, the little person on the bicycle's rolling downhill and falling into a sea that's the sea of the lack of support. They've got to swim through that and then navigate the obstacle course of risk. Then is the high altar of bureaucracy, which looks like a Mayan pyramid. And then right at the end is time. You're sort of swinging on the tightrope of time. And these can all feel like organizational barriers to creativity. You know, it could be like, Jenna, we haven't got time to be so creative. Just pick a solution and do it. And I'm only picking on Jenna because I can see her smiling face. So I hope we all, do we all recognize some of these things? I hope we do. So the book contains strategies of how to step beyond that, even into words you could use with your CEO, with your manager, with your professor, and with your colleagues, and even your mentees, because I know you're all doing that out there. It's about addressing inequality, because inequality isn't always visible as a bearded man of color. You know, that didn't matter in many situations where I'm facing exclusion and challenge, typically by a person in a uniform. You know, staring down the barrel of a Californian state trooper for the third time in the week because I hired a nice car and because, you know, a person of my color maybe shouldn't be driving it in certain areas is a statement of inequality in itself. Incidentally, using creative leadership principles, I'm always conducting research. And even whilst I was spread-eagled on the hood of a police cruiser, I was still asking the officer questions and asking him about his attitude and why, you know, his profiling of me, etc. And then when he realized that I wasn't a drug dealer or a would-be thief, we actually had a perfectly pleasant conversation, and I spent 20 minutes interviewing him about his job and how we could address prejudices on the ground. So creative leadership was also born from instances like that, and I don't think I've ever told that story before, so you guys are the first. The leadership world is dominated by certain voices, often loud and alpha, you know, whatever the gender. And many of us are excluded. I think most of you listening to this will probably have had that moment when you felt too brown, too black, too quiet, too short, too tall, too non-binary, too female. And this came forward, whether it was at school. You know, incidentally, at school, I was told that I would never lead anything because I was too introvert and too quiet. However, introversion is its own superpower, as is extroversion, but it needs to be tempered by these three values. So creative leadership is my response. Dismantle inequality through empathy and creativity. On screen, you'll see, you know, a single slide for the importance of inclusion. There's a person of African heritage wearing bright red glasses, and the text reads, "Glasses have existed for decades, but do not fit the face landmarks of low and wide nose profiles. This excludes many Black and East Asian people." And Akeem, the designer, whose company is called Reframed without an E, said, "I realized the problem wasn't with my face, but with the product itself." And isn't that a sort of damning indictment of how exclusion can literally be staring us in the face and we miss it? So it's about addressing broken forms of leadership. It came from a single insight in 2007 that we need leaders who are creative, and we need creatives to be in leadership positions. And I spoke about the gentle dissatisfaction and uncertainty already. So it's about helping you navigate uncertainty. I'll skip through some of these slides rather quickly. When I don't describe what's on the screen, it's just because they're words, and I'll bring them to life, hopefully, with the sound of my voice. But what's currently broken with leadership is that it's become too linked to hierarchy, status, and ego, not you know, rewarding loud voices, not quiet or wise ones. So life whispers its wisdoms. It doesn't shout it, but you have to become quiet enough to hear it in those around you and quieter enough within yourself. Because in some ways, the wisdom of yourself, you know, was drowned out from the moment that your heart started, the moment you were born and your mind started drowning out, beating out the wisdoms of your life. How many times do you sit down and think, okay, I'll just have a cup of tea, and a million thoughts come in to invade? So quietude is really important in creative leadership. The current model is outdated, built for an industrial era. You know, it's not complex, creative 21st century. It excludes difference. Many, many people don't see themselves in the leadership image, and as I said before, too young, too quiet, or many of the other qualifiers. So on screen is the tripartite model of creative leadership. And there's three kind of dynamic circles moving, they've got a little bit of motion built in. So at the top is one that reads empathy, and below it is the words heart. The next circle, the main word is creativity and hand. Then clarity in the third circle and head. So you have empathy, clarity, and creativity as the three values corresponding to heart, head, and hand. So these three pillars are built around a striking statement that everyone has leadership potential. Now, hands up, which one of you ever heard that said at school or at university or in a training course? Because I hadn't. Everyone has leadership potential. And that's even the most, some of the most excluded people are people with disabilities. So all of us there working in inclusive design as well, it's incredibly important. Empathy is the hallmark of a 21st century leader. Clarity is the link that aligns vision, direction, and communication. And it can work all of these three values can work personally, organizationally, or for a project. And creativity is that universal ability, and I'm going to keep on saying that, to develop solutions that positively impact the world around us, and importantly, impact yourself. We often forget about that bit. So what is creative leadership? Well, it's simply open sourcing leadership. It's giving you the tools to design the leadership that you want and you need. It starts with you. It's internal first and external second. It's a transformational process. So when you look at self-development, self-growth, and self-healing, that's built into it. This is not death by PowerPoint where you go to a course and you fulfill it. You run through the course, you tick the boxes. This is about deep personal engagement and empowerment. So it's personal and organizational. So I'll just go for another 5 minutes if that's okay. It's about people. And on screen, you see some workshops that I've given. I picked the photos where everyone is smiling to deliberately make those workshops look like great experiences. But in all seriousness, we typically score a 95% plus at a very good or excellent in terms of response. And very often people say this is the leadership course that I did not expect, but I thoroughly needed. Things like that. It's also about projects, and on screen you'll see some projects I did when I was at the Helen Hamlyn Centre with the London taxi and kind of architectural projects that looked at mental health and suicide from bridges. Both looking at well-being. There's another Forbes headline here. Why did I put Forbes so many times? Because I believe, at least in my mind, they had such a single-mindedness when I was growing up. So the fact that they have a headline like empathy is the most important leadership according to research. The fact Forbes, of all people, who usually spoke about wealth, that they're saying it, it's like almost looking for a really extreme group of people that will actually talk about humanity. Because if we just had a human rights group and I quoted them, you'd say of course they'll be talking about inclusive design. But for me, the fact that Forbes was saying it is really important. And empathy is a spectrum, so 3 images. On the left, you could have no empathy, like the brutal patriarch, the Godfather, as depicted by Marlon Brando. Or the right, on the total opposite end, you could be like Winnie the Pooh, who had too much empathy and kept on getting his head stuck in holes. and, was always searching for honey and worrying about his friends, where are they and what are they up to? And sympathy is not empathy. There's a cartoon on screen where sympathy is too much like the burning midday sun, whereas empathy gets it just right. And the cartoon here is a cloud cuddling the moon. And isn't it lovely? The moon's feeling lots of empathy and not overblown by sympathy. Clarity is a spectrum. So on the left, with no clarity, is coronavirus. No one knew what was going on. Do they really have to stay at home? Could you catch coronavirus by looking at another person? And then on the right is a Nike slogan, just do it, a very clear call to action. And consistency isn't clarity. Consistency is doing the same thing again and again and again and expecting a different result. So it's tunnel vision, like the blinkered horse you see in the cartoon. On the right, which is clarity, is the horse without blinkers who can see all around it and can run and roam free. So don't be blinkered, be the horse with a multiple perspective. Creativity is a spectrum. On the left is the Eye of Sauron, which wasn't very creative, just did more of the same kind of evil for 9 hours worth of movie. And on the right is any museum, art gallery, educational institution, scientific or artistic, where creativity is cranked up. And again, originality isn't creativity. Originality is like the gorilla trying to lift this massive piece of wood by itself, and it's all about brawn. You're lifting by yourself. But on the right is a family of mice who are lifting the same piece of wood, and the title here is Brain. Creativity is your deepest and fastest intelligence. So how might we fix leadership? Well, it's often said, if you can't see it, then you can't be it. But for us, the creative leaders, and that's all of you, by the way, if you can't see it, then you be it. You may have to be the first woman, the first man, the first person aged 21, the first person aged 71 to do something, but you be it. And in the book is the strategies for that. We use design methods so that leadership can be prototyped and co-created, and it's not a top-down infliction. One of the things we do in the workshop is we co-create the methods too. You do your own. And that's crazy, isn't it? It sounds absolutely crazy, but it's academically researched and proven that it will last longer. And finally, create cultures where emotional honesty, listening and learning are the strengths, not the weaknesses. Someone once said you can tear up all the HR manuals in the world and replace it with 2 words, be kind. And I think this is needed more and more when you look at some of the stories and activities that go on in the workplace and places of learning. Very quickly here, this slide just says the role of new voices. Only one thing to say, that we need new voices here, whether it's women of color, younger people, people of color, neurodivergent, and above all, creatives. AI isn't the answer. On screen is a picture of Mo Gadat, who was the author of the book Solve for Happy, and he said the one phrase that ChatGPT should learn is "I don't know." And I think for me it just brings to home the humanity of that phrase and the leadership of that phrase, because it is a leadership stance to be so non-threatened and non-threatening that when someone says, ask you something and you don't feel like many of my Indian uncles who feel they always have to give you an answer even if it's the wrong one, that you can say, I don't know. So I think I'll end on this case study. This is from the Valuable 500, which is a global movement for disability. Carolyn Casey, who was the founder, is legally blind and a former management consultant. On screen, you see two images. The bottom one is her on top of an elephant in India when she was in her late 20s, early 30s. And at the top is her in a more professional pose on stage. But she founded the Valuable 500 to put disability on the boardroom agenda. And as 1.3 billion people live globally with a disability, yet it's largely invisible in business leadership. So, how does she use the three things, the three values, the three pillars? Well, empathy, she used her lived experience to connect with CEOs. She listened deeply and humanized the issue of disability. Clarity was a simple, bold vision, 500 companies, but one commitment. And she framed disability as a valuable business asset. With creativity, she used the tools of storytelling, compelling speeches, and global platforms to grow this movement. And she designed a visually compelling campaign with strategic messaging. So I will draw to a close there so we have time for questions. But if you also wanted to contact me, my name is all over this episode, and you'll find me on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram. So please do DM me. Please don't send me an email because I probably won't read the email, but I always read DMs.
Thank you so much, Rama. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed learning about your book. I haven't read it yet, but very much looking forward to it. And I may have to do the audiobook to be able to hear you walk us through it. That would be even more revelatory, I think, rather than just the subject matter. So yeah, I just love where this is going, the conversation already. Clearly, your work speaks for itself. I learned of your work a few years ago when I first was introduced to the EIDD. And I think you know the story, and I think some of the people within FxD have heard a bit of this. But when I started my PhD, I was introduced to EIDD, the idea of design for all, inclusive design, universal design, no matter the terminology you use, at a Design for All event that happened in early 2019. And Yasmin Hersen had come from UHasselt and worked with Janice Rieger, who ended up being my supervisor for my PhD. And I just thought it was such a beautiful way of putting almost empathy into practice, but also engaging people in very meaningful ways and making sure that it wasn't just people designing for others and understanding too that by designing with and for the communities, then you're really able to apply some of that to that knowledge and understanding and wisdom to other groups as well and other demographics. And that's just been so powerful to me as a strategist and as a researcher to be able to have something that will resonate and have overwhelming, I think, sometimes impact that it can really
Yeah.
just get bigger and bigger over time and it becomes almost a movement because if you do engage some of the people, then of course then they kind of drink the Kool-Aid in a very legitimate way
Mm.
and can help spread that message. But yeah, thank you so much for that. So I do have some questions I'd like to get to, and we'll
Yeah.
just see where the conversation goes. Um, and I'll
Perfect.
go ahead and reflect as well as we go on some of the things that you presented. But I'd love to begin just by asking about your background. I personally love you're a mechanical engineer who appreciates the creative side of things because that's something that is a kind of terminology and perspective that I like to have is that creative engineer approach. But
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got here, those formative years, and how that influences your work today.
Sure. So I describe myself as Indian by ancestry, South American by descent, because that's where the family lived for 4 generations in British Guyana, uniquely
Mm.
part of the Caribbean, but also on the landmass of South America itself, next to Venezuela, Brazil. and close to Suriname. But I'm British by birth. So Indian ancestry, South American descent, British by birth. And what that means for me is really being a citizen of the world. I loved being creative. I studied, that's why creativity is central to the creative leadership model and is the only one of the values that appears in the title. Because grew up learning Indian classical music, painting, but I also love the sciences. I did maths and physics, as well as English and art and design in high school. And throughout my life, I also sit on the board of an Indian arts and cultural institution that I've performed Indian classical music. And people often say, what was the training you did for creative leadership workshops? What was the training you did to communicate inclusive design? And I say it's Indian classical music because you can learn that, teach that, sing that, understand it, and appreciate that. You can understand anything. So, my my life, I really wanted to spend it being very open-hearted. When I was in my teenage years, I wanted to serve humanity. And then by the time when I was in my 20s and I realized several people had taken advantage of me because of service, it came to improving life. So I believe very much in those principles of being in service rather than servitude, but also service of yourself, of growing yourself, and design. Creative leadership is also a huge part of that. So my early life, I think, was spent a lot with some great minds at my parents' house. They always had visitors from around the world, and you never knew who would be at the breakfast table. The leading artist in India, a professor from Japan, a scientist from the US. And we would have to entertain whilst my parents were busy getting breakfast ready and that was something learned from a very early age. So, thank you, mum and dad, for helping this introvert live in an extrovert world from those breakfast conversations.
I think that's beautiful, and especially the fact that you embrace that introverted perspective, because that's something that we've talked about too. Just some people within the community, especially the number of conferences that are going on nowadays, it kind of forces some of the introverts to be a bit more extroverted. And then sometimes people read us in different ways too, right? I
Mm.
mean, I come across more extroverted when I am passionately talking about the subject matter I care about,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I need to recover and go home and have that introverted lifestyle where I can just kind of sit quietly, read a book and listen to music just to recharge. And there's beauty in both sides and in the mixtures in between. Everything is a continuum. And I don't think enough people advocate for the middle. And that's something that, within the community, and one of the reasons it was formed was very much for that. It was advocating for transdisciplinarity, advocating for the researchers and the industry practitioners and
Mm.
everybody in between, no matter how they define themselves. And you really do that beautifully. So I really appreciate that perspective. It's always really uplifting to see that.
It's nice
Yeah.
nice to meet not just the like-minded but the like-hearted. And what you said there, we're very much alike in the heart. I love talking to people, meeting people, and one of the things I'm developing is that kind of career leadership strategy for introverts.
Yes.
Because a lot of people talk about this, how to dodge energy vampires and various other things, however, wherever you place yourself on the spectrum. But someone once said, I was doing a podcast and the interviewer said, when they were doing research, they hadn't come across anything that said leadership for introverts. And it's not that creative
Ah,
leadership is just create leadership for introverts, it's leadership for everyone, but it's inclusive of introverts. And that comes from academic study, actually, of
mm,
inclusive design. You know, um, in the beginning with inclusive design, all the academic scholarship was around, it's one size fits all. It's the disabled people. But now it's one size fits one. And I think
mm,
learnings from that translate hugely into creative, into creative leadership and what goes on there. So, that
yeah.
idea that who's excluded, who's excluded by leadership. And, we would always say, instead of design for older people, as it was maybe 20, 25 years ago. And then, I learned at one of my very first engagements as a academic and young designer starting out, a group of very articulate and enabled older people said, "Why are you designing something special for us?" Because the other word for special is stigmatizing. And it's the same thing with leadership. I met this amazing woman uh, who was built to be a leader from an early age and went through all the training. But she said what was hurting her and breaking her is now she's got into her 30s and into 40s and raising a family as well, and she's looking at what does the world look like for her daughter and her son, and she realized that she was selected at an early age to be a leader by her father, by her mother, by the school. And it excluded so many other people, including people like her daughter and son, who were less commanding in terms of their presence, shall we say, than her. And these individual stories, as an inclusive design researcher and academic, you're trained to draw meaning from the individual story and extrapolate that out for everyone. So that's why creative leadership, we say it's inclusive of rather than exclusive to, from that very first learning of don't design for older people, design to include, and include and design with.
Yes. No, I think that's really important. And it also speaks a little bit to the title itself. It's like, do we have creatives who are leading, or are we approaching leadership in a slightly different way that's more openly defined with creativity? And I think even just that example of, the person who was basically selected at birth to lead, and recognizing some of the differences too as life went on, that's very important. And, I think that's something too that a lot of us, especially those of us who are kind of in this middle experience point of our careers, is figuring out where we can lead. And maybe it's not going to be overtly in the front leading a company. Maybe it's going to look something slightly different. Maybe it's going to be mentoring and helping people to realize their best selves internally as well. And, how to actually not only recognize it, but to realize it, have that proof in the pudding,
Mm.
and be able to live that lifestyle too. And I think this would be a perfect book for being able to have that exploration and realization as a consequence. So really lovely. Yeah. And I
It's
think
beautiful.
I'm
Sorry.
curious. Yeah, I'm curious to see for the barriers. You were talking a little bit about stereotypes and inclinations and thoughts. What you think some of the barriers are to having spaces, products for people with physical, sensory, or cognitive disabilities? Is there anything in particular that you would highlight?
So I think the barriers, are you talking about the barriers, the little kind of triathlon marathon barriers up to creativity?
I was not formally, but we can go there with capital B barriers, the ones you recognized in your book. Yeah.
Well, I could probably answer a little bit of both because What I'm realizing is creative leadership um, was something that was intensely personal for the first year, because I didn't really think it had application to anyone else. I thought it might, um, and it was born with an open heart, um, you know, to open it up to other people. But it was intensely personal, just feeling hugely ignored for large parts of my life, especially as a teenager, feeling very small, very useless. And then seeing how designers, this amazing profession where everything in the world is designed and it gets lost. And that the book is a starting point, it's not an ending point. It's a launch pad. Some people have called it what's in there should become a movement. What's in there should, and you know, you struggle um, in so many different ways, and particularly bringing it back to the question, when you start to look at people with disabilities and the accessibility community who've welcomed these thoughts with open arms, because you know you'll start to see female leaders of different colors, metrics coming through, but in terms of disability, invisible. We're still at the slopes of, you know, saying to organizations, don't be afraid of someone in a wheelchair, don't be afraid of someone with autism, you know, uh, and people with disabilities, you know, the social rhetoric of aligning disability to lack of ability and therefore to weakness. You know, there's so many myths we'd like to throw away, and one of them is around that. You know, a person, just take physical disability, in a wheelchair will use 3 to 5 times more energy to get to the station than someone who just ambulates on two legs. That's
Yes.
incredible strength. So we we have to reframe the argument. We have to reframe misconceptions around our perspectives, because then barriers turn into bridges, whatever they are. And once did an exercise, and I would love to do it again, where people were bringing forth barriers, and myself and the team, we were turning them into opportunities.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
that's
The
also the
age-old
job.
consultant flip. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's true. It's a necessary exercise and really valuable if done well. So I love that. And just bridging those divides is something that's so important. You know, we've had ages, decades, where we have these specialties and silos that come as a consequence. And,
Mm,
you know, of course, we have the education systems and the career pathways and trajectories that are formalized that really seem to embed us in that culture. But you know, it's really how can we realize this in a slightly different way and recognize the value in some of those cross-pollinating approaches.
mm.
And yeah, I'd love to get your take on that. If you how you see the future going and how we could perhaps bridge some of those divides within disciplines, et cetera, a bit more easily and more effectively.
Yeah, talk. So
Yeah.
I know I'm being a little flippant here, and maybe I've got a bit more poetic um, at this time in my life, but people sometimes it comes down to something really simple, like creating those opportunities for people to talk. And sometimes it takes a company, you know, like Google, to enter in and say, we're going to give you 20% of time free to do what you want, what you think you should work on. And that just
Mhm.
removed all the red tape, and Gmail was born from it.
Mhm.
You know, the other famous example was a Volkswagen Golf GTI back in the 80s. Well, late 70s, early 80s. The first small car to drive like a big one. Now we take it for granted. You could jump in a tiny car, smart car, and drive across Europe, no problem. But up until then, small cars were meant for towns, big cars were the executive intercity cruisers. And the GTI changed that. And at first, Volkswagen said no. Then they said a really interesting thing of actually, we don't quite get it. And then they said an even more interesting thing of we'll give you some space and you can work on it in your own time. And a group of dedicated engineers created the GTI, which proved that a small car could drive like a big one.
Mm.
And another signature moment in human transport. So why, when I say talk, underneath that are huge amounts of bridges and barriers, but sometimes it's as simple as in one organization they removed the fruit bowl conversations that used well sorry they used to put a fruit bowl in the kitchen area at 11 o'clock every day, and
Mm.
people would go and get their healthy fruit. And then they stopped it because of they realized they could save, whatever it was, £200 a day if they weren't buying people fruit. But what went down was talking, conversation, random meetings. They could measure the innovation go down, the innovation pipeline go down. But what went up is dissatisfaction. So people started complaining about all sorts of other things: the lunch, the coffee, the elevators, the showers, bike parking. Because at 11 o'clock, what was happening was a few things. People were talking, and I would say to you, "Oh, yeah, Jenna, did you, you know, did you get anywhere to park your bike this morning?" No, no, I didn't. Yeah, maybe we could talk to, estates about this. Great. And suddenly you feel you've progressed a pain point, and you've heard my pain point, and we're doing something about it. So it doesn't become a pain landscape. It's just a point. It's a springboard. It's not a context you live in.
Mm.
And when they brought that back, complaints went down, innovation went up. So, what are the points you give people for free talking? And there's some people who, you've got to cater for all, because there's some people who will say, work is work and home is home. And absolutely respect that, but it's not also something I follow, which is also detrimental to me. Um,
Yeah.
because, work and life isn't about balancing, it's about blending. And you do need time, by yourself, with your family, whatever rejuvenates you. But also, if you're just seeing work as a mechanistic, factory-based, production focused, output-looking activity, where's the joy?
Yeah.
And where's the connectivity? Where's the humanity? So, alongside the word talk, there's also the word love, that you should have a little grating of love in everything you do, even
Mm.
your journey. I take the Central Line, and those of you who know the Central Line in London, it's without air conditioning. Um, and but I've flipped it from loathing to loving by equipping myself in my rucksack with the things I needed: fridge cold water, noise cancellation. And I actually said, what I'm going to do on the Central Line, which felt like I was losing years in my life on the Central Line, I'm going to add years to my life. So I am going to pick the music that uplifts. So, whether Hertz vibration music for, calmness or creativity. There's not so much for creativity actually, but like calmness or something like that. Or that podcast or the latest academic reading. So you put in an academic paper into a screen reader for visually impaired people and listen to it. And
Mm.
suddenly the Central Line has become a place of nourishment. So creative leadership is also about actively taking control of the only thing you can, which is your actions. And I'm not saying I'm very much a student in this. And although I wrote the book, I'm a student alongside anyone else who features in it and anyone else who's reading it. And it's the opinions and perspectives of 1,000 voices. It's not just mine. I almost feel the book, I was a collator of thoughts and ideas and a curator, and I drove it through with some of my own. But yeah, the book manifested itself, if you like. The words, the words were curated through my hand and through my voice, but it's the voices of 1,000 stories.
Mm. That's beautiful. And I love even just the perspective on the central line. As you know, I was just there recently and it is about curating your conditions. And we've all worked in horrible workplaces. And, as I evolved to even just out of general consulting to more built environment consulting, partially because of my recognizing how much I'm influenced by my spaces, I now travel with a little fan. I have headphones. I mean, it is a curated experience no matter where I
Yeah,
go, as best as I can do. And that's really where you can activate things like flourishing scholarship and well-being science, because it's about having that autonomy, competence, and relatedness with things like self-determination theory, and just bringing all that to the fore and enabling people to craft. I love the idea of job crafting. Amy
yeah,
Rabinovsky really developed that within the job atmosphere and work conditions, but being able to experience that crafting, that's become really big in a lot of the work that I do and the research I'm really enthralled by, because it's not just creating conditions and products for people, it's working with them on what that might look like, but also activating them so that they can feel engaged and use the spaces in different ways. So I
yeah.
think that that's something that you really beautifully recognize and design for within your work. And one thing that we didn't do, and I kind of jumped ahead, so this is really my fault. We didn't really go to the what does design for all mean for you? So I'd love to just get your definition of that.
Sure. So if I can start with design, so whether it's the design in inclusive design, design for all, or universal design, there's the word design. So what is
Mm,
design? And I've read, canvassed, researched, and asked for many, many. And some of my favorite include what an 8-year-old in Hong Kong said. So her mother was a civil servant taking part in a workshop, and she reported back. It says it was their homework to ask someone in their family, what does design mean? And the 8-year-old said, designers they create something that is useful from nothing.
mm,
So, um, and
that's lovely.
before the design, there was nothing. Before the iPhone, there was nothing. And and so it was almost existential, poetic, and you know, it was almost like gazing into, the telescope of the stars and saying, there was nothing and here is something. My
Yeah.
personal is that design is the act of creating. And there's a couple of things in
Mm,
there because it's an act. Design, when it becomes a noun, becomes static. So here is a design, and I'm holding up a pair of glasses. That's a design, it's a thing. But to design, it's to live, it's to breathe, it's to move, it's an activity from here to there.
mm,
And when you start to
like,
add inclusive, for all, or universal, for me, I add one more thing to the definition. It's in brackets together. So
mm,
it's the act of creating together. And who is the together?
yes.
Well, you get to choose.
Yeah. That's lovely. Yes, I think that's great. And without choosing to exclude, hopefully, and having a balance, but yeah, making sure that
Yeah.
everybody can really be part of that conversation. Yeah, I think
And sorry, just on that note
go
about
ahead.
exclusion, here's
Yeah.
the slightly ugly truth about design for all, inclusive design is most of what you do will exclude someone. So have a
Hmm.
good reason for doing it. If you make working in accessibility all these years, you realize you do something for visually impaired people and it'll affect those with hearing
Mhm.
challenges or cognitive or wheelchair or, people using guide dogs. So disability, I always like to think of it like a shared space. So
Mhm.
there's very few things in the world that are truly inclusive. I was going to say sunlight, but there's some people who are allergic and some people who burn very easily, for
Right
example.
here.
So, one could probably say oxygen.
Hmm.
You know, the,
It's a
the,
little bit more open, yes.
the constitution of air, but, you know, it's then you're getting into the realms of like life-centered design. But what does that mean?
Mhm.
Because, um, a hugely rich chocolate cake is part of life. That's life-centered design, but it's also part of diabetes giving design. So, if we
Mhm.
could go way too expansive, and that's just one of the issues I have with the term life-centered,
Mhm.
is you know you've taken us up in the plane. We're at 36,000 feet, but how does the plane land? Because it hasn't got, to me, life-centered design at the moment hasn't quite got wheels to land the plane. And inclusive design was like that in the early days. We're inclusive, it's massive. How do you land it? And one way of landing it was specificity, was clarity, to use creative leadership. And it was clarity about who is being excluded. So, hey, let's start with older people and people with disabilities. Let's start with physical, because then we know how to land the plane. And hey, now let's also look at autism and dementia. And with autism, it's also about age, because a lot of younger adults with autism need design. And then you expand, you
Mhm.
expand, you expand. So creative leadership, again, is also about landing things, not just giving a great concept. So many books out there are brilliant at giving you the concept. And I've done this so many times in the past. I'm trying to learn from my own mistakes. And I don't know if the book does it. I'd love to hear from people if it does. But certainly now I'm trying to land my own plane, give wheels to something called creative leadership. Been trying to do it for 15 years. And those are the structures and the strategies we put in place, because otherwise it's like describing what a bicycle is um, to people who've never ridden a bicycle. And this wonderful machine that can get you from there to there with much less energy. So here's the manual, here's the video, here's the concept of the bicycle, but not actually teaching them how to ride it and not actually giving them a bicycle. The nearest bicycle is actually in the Antarctica, but I've told you all about it. So, and I think with creative leadership, one thing I'm sort of doing at the moment is, and it really started 15 years ago, is interrogating it, because a French philosopher, so it said, when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. And when you invent electricity, you invent electrocution. So we all think about the invention and it's great and ChatGPT and Claude. What about electrocution and shipwrecks? So that's also part of inclusive design. Who am I excluding and who am I hurting? Because you will hurt someone, guaranteed.
Right. Yeah. It can't always be perfect. And we had Daniel Christian Wall on a couple of months ago. I don't know if you know his work on regenerative design, but
Yeah,
there was a comment about that and reflection he had made in the past, which was about oftentimes we're trying to rectify our designs of the past because we learn
yeah.
over time what might be better, or perhaps something was taken out of context or has taken on a life of its own as other circumstances change outside. So yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. Well, I know we're running a bit out of time. I think that we could talk to you for ages. In fact, we might need to invite you back for a session with the community, but I'd like to just get some final thoughts from you. You were talking a little bit already about balancing out individual needs with the needs of a group for designing, but how
Mm,
do you include diverse users throughout the design process? Are there any tools or frameworks that you
yeah.
use that you would recommend to the group?
So I'm going back to lots of conversations over the years where, um, so if I may present that bit through the voice of questions and challenges I've had in boardrooms and classrooms. So you could almost role play this a little bit. So you walk in and you say, yeah, we need to bring in the voice of, let's say, disabled people, physically people in wheelchairs. 5% of people registered disabled, people with wheelchairs. So, um, and they'll say, well, surely that's a niche market. And you say it's not niche, it's lead. Um, so if you were going to design a tennis racket, you instead of getting 100,000 people in your focus group to start off with, you'd probably bring in Serena Williams. Because if it's good enough for her, it's good enough for everyone else. So it's the same thing. If you're going to design this automatic door, bring in a person in a wheelchair, and then you extrapolate it outwards because what's good for someone with extreme needs, whether their name is Serena, the tennis player, or Serena, a person in a wheelchair, they'll push the boundaries of your investigation and therefore your imagination. And they'll do that very simply. You can spend an afternoon with them, 1 hour with them, and you'll get inspiration you can think of with your 50-person team sitting in your design studio. So that's number one. Number two is now multiply Serena by 5. So you're talking to Serena, a 5-year-old, someone with arthritis, and say another tennis player, a male tennis player, Andre Agassi or someone. Now you've taken what she's driven and you've extrapolated it. So you're probably now gone from getting 40% of the population to nearly 80. But you're doing it in a way that you haven't thought about. So the simple rule here is to summarize it for the community, is you are listening to, you're using one person to drive invention through listening, just through their lived experience. But then you're taking it and extrapolating it outwards. You'll need to leave sometimes your favorite user on the cutting room floor. You'll need to sometimes, have two conflicting opinions, but that's your work to balance. Don't give it to them. Don't say because Betty age 95 said this, rugby player age 25 said this. We should let them fight it out. True story from the taxi project, by the way. We had to take it and come up with something that worked for both, or if not, something that doesn't work for Betty or the rugby player, and be able to look them in the eye and say, this is why it doesn't work for you. In that situation, the rugby player lost because we were like, you're such a huge guy that you're off the percentile charts for, so you can get in this taxi and you'll have the headroom, but we need to make this design decision because Betty, age 95, needs to get her electric wheelchair in and move it around. So that's why
Yeah.
this particular thing needs to be her. And sorry for your specifications. You know what he said? Great. So also explaining things to people is incredibly important. This is why this is done in the way it is. But learning from other industries, so you don't have to all the time say, I've got to canvas 1 million people. You could look at what other industries did and bring that into your specific situation. So it's ever the dance and the balance. Numbers go wide, but even statistics are just numerical opinion. So bring it down to real human stories, and it's also a pitch tool. Because if you stand up and you say, well, 95% of people prefer a spoon over a fork, it's useful information, but how do you bring it to life? And how do you get any invention from that? It's information, but is it inspiration? So if you were able to show videos of people using spoons and forks and draw a human conclusion, you might actually say, well, wait a minute, most people are using spoons because they're easier, they're easier to put in the mouth, and the fork looks scary because it looks like the devil's trying to feed you or something like that. So what if we redesign the fork in this way? Because otherwise you may go down the route of just trying to sell more spoons instead of forks. And actually, the market for forks are totally open. And the, food that needs forks suddenly isn't getting sold. So,
Right.
we're excluding the fork wielding population. So if you see a bit of a flippant example, but you see what I mean? It's
No.
the statistics don't bring to life the stories. So you need both stats and stories.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see more valuing, I think, of qualitative stories. I mean, notwithstanding some of the hesitation for research funding over the past few months, but I do like that there is a balance and less of a focus only on quantitative and appreciation for that information as well as inspiration, as you put it, with the qualitative side. So I think that that's really beautiful. And even you spoke to the element of accountability. A lot of us know kind of like theoretically that we should design for, Jeremy Meyerson's bullseye and the edges, or however you want to
Mm,
personify that and describe it, without making it off-putting with putting people at the edges, but designing with people intentionally. And then also thinking about that next step of accountability, making sure that if you were asked by those people why you did something, I think that is really important for us to be able to say, this is why that group was excluded. This is why, I interpreted in this way. And, I really was trying to do the right thing. And I think that that's where intent comes into play as well. So being good designers, all those different facets, I think
mm.
do impact the process and the outcome. Really
Yeah,
important. Hmm.
it so is that. Creativity isn't a single standpoint either.
Yeah.
So I I believe, we are able as creatives, able as academics actually to live with a certain level of uncertainty. Because when you're doing a
Yeah.
PhD, when you're doing a master's, you don't know what's going to be coming out at the end.
Mhm. Yeah, I had a
And
pandemic hit during mine. I was doing my confirmation
yeah,
seminar, and it was our first week back at home
yeah.
in 2020. So you never know. True.
So you're
Mm,
constantly, reading the signs and you're
mm,
orientating. And just what I would love to see more of in the world, people often say, well, what's one change that you could make? And there's a few things, but one of them is actually to give people more, the give more, sorry, I'm going to say that again, is to
okay.
increasingly give people the gift of time. And it's
Mm,
not numerical time, it's the heart concept of time. Because a time to think, a time to contemplate, a time to not feel that I have to be writing or scripting or doing my Viva or my presentation or my rebrand or, whatever it is
yeah.
in order to feel like I'm achieving. I think we need much more kindness in the world. And kindness is activated by connection. And connection
Mm,
doesn't mean you have to hug each other and, plait each other's hair and wear pajamas together and have a pillow fight. And I think that's the thing. I'm
mm,
sick and tired of people who say, everything should be at arm's distance. That's fine. I mean, many people have reasons for doing that. And if you have your reasons, you have your reasons. But what happens if everyone just nudges a little bit more to connecting, and connecting by this I just mean can mean even listening. So listening is the deepest form of connection. It's the most straightforward way of connecting, active listening. The number one thing people ask for in our leadership research, active listening. What if we were able to do that? Because, you can keep your distance then, but you can still show you're actively listening. And then
Yes.
acting on that listening. What would the world look like then? What would a team look like? What would a family look like? If, there's a bossy grandmother or a overbearing father figure in the family, just able to listen a little bit more. How easier would that make family life or the academy, or the organization? Then you may come up
Exactly.
with, the Golf GTI or Gmail. If you listen.
You never know. Yeah, exactly. We'll see. So let's do final question if we would.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I'm curious to ask what your vision for the future of inclusive design is, especially one that would promote flourishing. What are your thoughts on that?
So inclusive design should cease to exist. That's my
Mhm.
vision of it. It's the end of it,
Yeah.
actually. Because why should we need inclusive if design had that baked in? If
Mhm.
every design was inclusive, every creative action was inclusive, if we saw everyone as a part of a worldwide family, in Sanskrit we have this phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. And it's not a cringeworthy statement. It's just speaking, do you have respect for the plants in your garden? Do you, one of my uncles, when he would leave a hotel room, when he would walk in, he would say, just say, I'm here, please look after me. And he'd say that to the clerk. And when he left, he would just say, thank you for
Mhm.
having my stay. And people may think, oh, you're mad talking about to inanimate objects. But actually, what you're doing is singing singing the song of the soul of the universe to the
Mhm.
universe. And when you start doing that with people, so how it might translate, and this I learned from a previous girlfriend in an ex-relationship, who at the end of each day, even if, you've maybe rubbed each other up the wrong way or maybe even had an argument, pretty much end of each day or in the morning, she'd say, thank you for getting my favorite magazine. And, I really appreciate that you cooked my favorite chicken last night. And I started doing it. And what that did in that little microcosm, again, thinking of inclusive design being here, and then you extrapolate it outwards, I started doing that at work. Hey, thanks, Chris, for just going the extra mile on that presentation. And of course, us being in England, people look flustered. But, you know, a year later, Chris said to me, I changed the name Chris to protect the innocent. But, said to me, I was going through a really difficult time, at that moment. And I just knew coming to work, you seeing me, almost every week, you'd comment on something, on my work and what I did. I just knew that that was not just a safe space, but an enabled one and a joyous one. So I know it's a bit of a long answer, but inclusive design, if we were to all act a little bit more, consideration is another way. Just nudge a little bit, the world becomes a bit more inclusive. Design becomes much more inclusive. And we do ourselves out of a job because you don't need inclusive design. You just have design. And One thing my mother had said to me when I was a teenager really rings true is because how do you do that? That sounds fraught with uncertainty and all of these things. So there's two things. One I wrote for myself, and the other my mum told me, and it's from an Indian poet, and it's just they're very short lines. But I've really brought them with me into my academic, my professional career, as well as my life. Um, and the first is when I was 15 and I was saying to my mum, I just don't know what I can do in this. And again in my 20s when I said, I'm in this thing called inclusive design, but I love it. But it feels like the love, the empathy isn't enough. How do I get clarity about it? Where's this going? What's the end game? All of these things. And she just recited two lines. She said, what light does destiny have for her little children stumbling in the dark? And the heavens responded, a blind understanding. And just that thing of a blind understanding, that's been enough for me to go through a 26-year career because I trust there's an understanding there. But it's like what you said about COVID. And you didn't know COVID was going to happen, but your understanding took you through. The other thing that I wrote for myself was all of these things we've spoken about are amazing concepts, amazing action points, but they can feel very big. So how do you start? And what I wrote for myself was this. And it's the opening lines of an upcoming novel that I have. It's not to do with leadership, and it is everything about leadership. It's life, really. It's a collection of 9 stories. But it's the bird's most important flight is its first, born from uncertainty and disbelief, but driven by its ancestral memory of touching the sky. So, what is your ancestral memory? What is the thing that lives deep within you that longs to locate itself in the sky, in the universe of other people's experiences? What is that thing that lives alongside the heartbeat of your life? And it's often not a career, it's a feeling. So, what is that feeling that is there? And the quicker you can come to the truth of that, the more satisfying, joyful, energizing, innovating, complex, beautiful, and simple your life will be. So that for me is also really important in creativity. Uncertainty and ancestral memory. Be a good ancestor, then you'll be a good
Mm.
creator.
Oh, that's beautiful, Rama. Yeah, Rama Gheerawo, my goodness, information as well as inspiration, as promised. The art of storytelling is really what this was. But that last quote, I really loved the beginning of that next book, the novel that you're working on, the idea of the bird. So I think if we leave it at that, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And yeah, we look forward to having you stay in touch with the community and continuing to learn from you.
I'd love to be a part. And Jenna, once again, thank you for having me on. I think it's your questions that are bringing out the answers. So thank you for asking
Oh,
them.
of course. Really happy to do so. All right. Thank you so much. Until
Okay.
next time.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone, for now.